Rodents very easily get addicted to cocaine. They will press a lever for cocaine until exhaustion or death. But if that cocaine is then taken away, that behavior will extinguish, which means that the mice will eventually just stop pressing the lever, right? Because they're not getting any cocaine. Totally makes sense. And then they'll go off and do something else in the cage. But if they're then exposed to a very painful foot shock, right? So a very extreme physical pain, which you could equate to a serious life stressor, the first thing the rat will do is run over to the lever and start pressing for cocaine. Which tells us that once our brain has discovered a drug that releases a lot of dopamine in our reward pathway, even after we stop using that drug, if we are exposed to an extreme stressor, our brain will tell us immediately, go and do that thing that gives us a lot of dopamine because you are under stress and I need to be relieved of stress. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Yeah. So if you discover your drug of choice when you're younger and it's food or it's pornography or if it's, I don't know, anything that really made you feel good for a moment of pleasure, that will always become, in the case of these rodent experiments, the thing you run back to when life gets hard.
Right. And we see that again and again in people in sustained recovery from addiction, that when they are under stress, that is a trigger potentially for them to relapse. So they have to be really thoughtful in their lives for, number one, trying to avoid stressful situations. And by the way, stress can come in many different forms. There's a great acronym in Alcoholics Anonymous called HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Those kinds of stressors, everyday stressors, which we all experience, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, can trigger us to want to use. So people in recovery have to be really thoughtful about not getting too hungry, not getting too angry, not getting too lonely, and not getting too tired.
How often have you worked with addicts? Have you spent much time working with addicts directly?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So that's the bulk of my career, is working with people with all different kinds of addictions. I think that part of the problem is that we've organized our lives now around rewards. Almost everything that we do is predicated on the feel-good moment we'll have at the end of it. And because of that, we are missing out on the process. We're projecting our psyche forward into the future toward the reward and not able to really be here in the moment. Okay, this is going to sound weird. I'm going to give you a weird example. So driving over here today, I found I was nervous for this interview and in a way looking forward to it, but in a way wanting it to be over, right? And in seeing that in myself, I thought, that's so sad. Like that's so sad that we live our lives that way, myself included, always this weird blend of wanting whatever we're doing to be over, so that in a way we can just go hide and do whatever that self-stim thing is that we do where we're safe and we're like, stimulating ourselves in some way. And then I thought, well, what if I knew that I was going to die right after this is I'm going to come off really weird now. But what if I knew that I was actually going to die right after our conversation today? That totally changes my perspective, doesn't it? Because this time you and I that's all I got. It's over for me this conversation is it. I really better be right here, right now, and really taking joy in whatever you and I can find together. And I think the more we can do that, the better.
What's happening there? You're removing the thought of the outcome, the reward, the potential, failure or whatever, and you're focusing on just being present. And in doing so, what is happening?
It's a great question, and I've actually given this quite a lot of thought, because I remember when I was in college and I, met some like Zen people, and they were like, be here now, be here now. And I thought, well, whenever I'm here now, I'm miserable. Like I don't like me, and I don't like being in the world. I don't want to be here now. I want to be somewhere else. So I didn't really understand what they were getting at. It really took me till I had lived quite a lot of life and had some significant experiences and given it some thought, that I realized, be here now means be here now and be uncomfortable. and be okay with being uncomfortable and being okay with not being able to control my pleasure or my pain or my comfort level, but just being open to whatever comes. And I think that's a key shift, that I'm not trying to control my experience in the moment, and that it's okay to be unhappy or restless or uncomfortable, and not trying to run away from that, but just really turn and face it and embrace the discomfort, which I also think is quite universal. I don't think I'm alone in that. And then the key piece about not anticipating the reward helps me be in the moment, right? Because I'm not just waiting for the good thing to come after. I'm saying to myself, imagine there's nothing good coming after, nothing at all, right? There aren't rewards. This is it. And then also being able to say, and it's okay if in the moment, like, it's not great. Like, I can embrace that. I can be unhappy or restless or anxious or whatever it is. And then when I do that, I feel like there's a funny thing that happens, and all of a sudden I'm not as anxious, right? And I am present, and there is some joy there.
Interesting. So when you allow yourself to deal with being uncomfortable in the moment, it turns out it removes the thing that was making you uncomfortable in the moment, which is like the avoidance or the worry or overthinking, or whatever else.
Yeah, I think we have this, and it's fed by modern culture, this kind of expectancy that really we should be happy all the time. And that if we've arranged things appropriately for our lives, and if we've done our work and, aimed true, then we should just be like, life is great. And I don't believe that anymore. I think that, like Buddha said, life is suffering, but I really think that fundamentally, like, it's uncomfortable to be alive, and that it's a kind of a constant state of restlessness and discomfort. If we're being really honest and tuning in, when I really let myself see that and feel that, all of a sudden I'm freed from some of that.
What has caused your anxiety throughout your life in the moment? You referenced earlier that some things have happened that have led you to understand this better and understand yourself better. What am I missing from this jigsaw puzzle?
Yeah, well, you're good. You could have been a psychiatrist.
Oh, really? Yeah. It's always time. This doesn't work out.
There's still time. Right. Yeah. It's not too late. You get a new profession. Yay. I think, for me, the big turning point was that we lost a child. And in the immediate aftermath of our child's death, I was just determined to sort of undo the experience and, get enough psychotherapy and enough whatever it took to sort of not feel that pain. And it wasn't until I really just said, I'm going to feel this pain for the rest of my life, it's never going away, that suddenly I felt some relief from that pain. And that was a real window for me.
So interesting that it's acceptance.
Yeah. And I think, one of the reasons I love treating patients with addiction is because I really relate to that hitting bottom moment, that moment when it's like, you just have the feeling that, like, everything I try to do to manage this behavior or to make my life better only makes it worse. I felt like I had a very similar experience. And that it was only when I kind of realized, I can't run from this. I can't outrun this pain. That I began to have the beginnings of relief from that experience.
I can't outrun this pain. It's our natural sort of disposition to try and outrun pain, isn't it?
That's the irony, right? We're really wired to outrun the pain. We are. We reflexively seek out pleasure and avoid pain, and yet that's the very thing that doesn't get us to where we want to go.
But we do now live in a world where it's very easy to outrun the pain.
Yes.
This is not a lion that's chasing me. This could be a bad email, and then I open up a tab and start doom scrolling, or open up a tab and start playing video games or pornography or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are so many ways that we can now distract ourselves from, our own suffering or our own awareness.
And where do you find yourself now with dealing with that grief and the pain as we sit here?
Yeah, I feel like in many ways it's been a real gift in my life. It's really informed my life in ways that, I've learned things from that experience that I think it would have been almost impossible for me to learn otherwise.
On page 40 of Dopamine Nation, you say we've lost the ability to tolerate even minor forms of discomfort.
Yeah.
And as I was reading through this section of your book, I was thinking, it sounds like we've gone a little bit soft in society. We've reset our pleasure pain threshold to the side of pain, that even the slightest thing feels like trauma to us. Even things that, objectively speaking, a generation or two ago would not have been considered traumatic are now trauma. We live in a bit of a trauma society. One that doesn't appear to be very resilient. And the only measure of that I have is if I think about the work that my grandfather had to do versus the work that, people maybe in my generation do and complain about and seem to be like objectively suffering over and stressed about. It seems like there's been a shift in our threshold, our tolerance levels. Can this be explained through dopamine? What's going on here? And do you believe that's true? Have we gone a bit soft?
I would say succinctly, yes, I do believe we have gone a bit soft, but I don't think it's a moral problem or a character problem. I actually think it's a physiological problem based on the fact that we're insulated from pain and we're exposed to all kinds of pleasures. So I really think that we have individually and collectively reset our reward pathways to the side of pain, meaning that the gremlins have now accumulated on the pain side. We've tipped ourselves to the side of pain.
Because we've had so much pleasure.
Because we've had so much pleasure. Yes, thanks for having me clarify. So that, now we need more and more pleasure to feel any pleasure at all. And the slightest little pain, and we're, experiencing excruciating pain. You add to that the fact that we have a culture that tells us we should never be in pain, and that if we are, something's wrong with our life, or something's wrong with our wife, or something's wrong with our job. And so now you've got, a whole generation of folks who feels like they're experiencing more pain because they're literally do not have the mental calluses to tolerate pain. And now they're being told, and if you have any pain at all, you must have, something wrong with your brain. Go see a doctor, go take a pill. And I think this is really, this is not a direction we want to keep going in.
We have a mental health culture where we assume most things are a mental health illness. In page 186 of your book, you say, I've become convinced that the way we tell our personal stories is a marker and predictor of mental health. Now, if you live in a society where everything has a label and it's a disease or an illness, or, I don't feel good today, so I've got this disorder and therefore I need this medication. I guess there's two questions. Is my assessment of the situation correct? And B, is this a bad place to be in a society where we think every feeling we have, we think everything that makes us different is a deficiency?
Let me answer this by talking a little bit about the role of language and narrative, because I think this is very fascinating. And, as a psychiatrist and a therapist, that is my bread and butter, right? Is narrative, how people tell their stories. Mm-hmm. By giving language to our experience, we gain awareness of our conceptual models of the world. Okay. And what I have learned over time is that the way people tell their stories is a window into their model of the world, and that there are healthy narratives and not so healthy narratives. And in general, in my clinical experience, when people come into the room and they tell their life story in such a way that they're always the victim of other people and circumstance in the world, those are people who are, number one, not doing well, and number two, not going to do well going forward unless they change that narrative to acknowledge what they've contributed to the problem. And the reason for that is because the way that we narrate our lives is not just a way to understand our past, it actually is our roadmap for the future. So if I see myself as a victim, and that's my narrative, I will literally create victimhood for myself going forward. I will literally change my sensed experience so that whatever happens, I'll make sure I end up as a victim. When people with severe addiction get into recovery, one of the most palpable changes that I see is the way that they narrate their lives. They go from, in addiction, talking about their lives as if it's always everybody else's fault, to in recovery, talking about their lives in a way that says, oh, you know what? I could have done better here. Or, you know what? That's something that I keep doing that really messes with my life that I want to change, and I'm going to figure out how to change that.
Why is it so hard to take responsibility in such a way?
Great question. We just hate to do it. Because when we do it, we feel shame, and shame is an incredibly painful emotion. It's like a gut punch of an emotion that is associated with fear of abandonment, fear of being shunned by our tribe. We'd much rather paper that shame over with anger and resentment toward others.
It's interesting because there'll be different groups of people listening to this now. There'll be the high responsibility group that just love and revel in taking responsibility because they think taking responsibility means that they are strong. It means that I'm so strong, I can take the blame and withstand it. And it's funny because the more I've learned to take responsibility for things in certain areas of my life, the more I've become proud of myself and the more I think I'm strong. And I'm like, oh, look at me, I can take responsibility for anything. And then if you go down this spectrum, you'll eventually get to the end of the spectrum where you've got people who, even as they heard you say that, will feel cognitive dissonance. They'll feel a sense, like a little, it'll irritate them. It'll piss them off. And they will be the whataboutery gang. They'll be saying, yes, but what about Dave? He did this to me. And, they'll like the immediate reaction would be, they're pissed off. They've probably gone now. They've gone. So we're not even talking to them anymore. But if you but it's fine. We can talk about them. They're no longer here.
Right, there you go.
But that group of people, my question really is, how do you speak to that group of people and convince them that actually taking personal responsibility is a good thing for them? And if they're focused on what their core values or their North Star is in their life, then personal responsibility is the path there, not blame, not victimhood. How do you turn those people around?
Great question. And I have to say, what I know about this, I learned from Alcoholics Anonymous and what they do, because they do something that's really incredible. First of all, it's necessary to validate somebody's victimhood. So this is to say you have been wrong. If they really have been wronged, to validate that, or you experienced this trauma, or you were born into this crappy situation and you were just a kid and you had no choice about that, and to really acknowledge that. But then the fourth step of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous talks about looking at each of those situations, and after writing down, like, this person wronged me and exactly what they did. So, taking time to focus on the resentment, right? Then only after that to say, okay, but is there anything that I did that contributed to that problem? Is there anything at all that I could have done differently? And for a little kid, born into a horrific situation, there's not much, right, that a kid could have, we don't expect a child to take responsibility. But the adult who was that child, who continues to perpetuate some of the harms they experienced on other people, now we're talking. Now you can begin to take responsibility for your actions in the world. So I think starting with validating, the trauma or the victimhood or the way in which we were wronged, processing it, so giving it airtime, right? But not stopping there, which is by the way, often, in therapy, certain types of therapy, that's often where we stop. We don't then take it that very important next step and say, but, let's go and look at that again. And is there anything at all that you're contributing to this problem? Maybe it's just that you continue to ruminate about it, right? That you're ruminating on your resentments is in a way your happy place. And maybe that's what you need to stop doing.
So that form of sort of psychotherapy that stops there can help keep us sick and make us sick. Yeah. It's interesting because someone that's in that therapy room who has ruminated themselves all the way down to having a low self-esteem, being depressed or whatever, it appears to me that people who are at that sort of ground floor state find it hardest to take responsibility for some reason. That's an observation in my life that the people that I have met that are the worst still, that struggle the most with taking responsibility, are those that have a very low self-esteem. So it's almost this double-edged, like, catch-22. And then I've also pondered whether, someone that never takes responsibility is more likely to have bad things happen to them, make mistakes, which are then going to further hurt their self-esteem, which are going to make it even harder to take responsibility. On this point of how we help someone in our lives who's suffering with some of the things we've talked about today, what is a bad way to try and help someone? Because we're in our love for them, sometimes we do things which, even in my own experience of people that are struggling in my life, I think in my pursuit of helping them, I've actually hurt them in some way.
Yes. Well, there's this whole sort of area of the addiction field called codependency. And codependency refers to the ways in which a loved one of the addicted person can actually enable or make their addiction worse without realizing it and without intending to. And the way that essentially happens is that number one, addiction is very often a family systems problem. So the person who gets addicted, their addiction affects everybody in the family. And in order to cope and compensate, the families can end up in these very strange, maladaptive places. But they often have difficulty seeing how to get out of those situations or how their behavior is harming their addicted loved one, because in a sense, they themselves get addicted to the addicted person and then use that addicted person to regulate the way that they feel. So, for example, I treat a lot of families where, like, the adult child is deep in their addiction. The parents know that the money they're giving the child is mostly going to drugs and yet cannot bring themselves to stop giving the money. And often they're manipulated by the child saying, the adult child saying something like, well, if you don't give me money for drugs, I'm going to go get it off the streets and it's going to be laced with fentanyl and then I'm going to die and it's going to be on your hands. So this kind of like emotional hostage taking. But even when it's not that blatant, what can happen is just this very fascinating, very twisted and meshed relationship between the addicted person and the codependent person, where, again, having the person engage in their addiction in a way is a predictable scenario for the codependent person. So even though they may say on the face of it, they want this person to stop their addiction, on another level, they really don't. They get to be the martyr. They get to be the savior, or they even just get to predict what that person is doing based on their use.
I've had experiences in my life, and this is why I really wanted to ask this question, where I thought I was helping someone.
Yeah.
And then the minute I withdrew the help and basically completely gave up, the person got better.
Yes.
But for 6, 7, 8 years,
wow.
This person struggled.
Yeah.
And the minute I stopped helping,
yep.
they got better.
Yeah.
I was like, so I said to my partner before when I was talking about this, I was like, it's possible to prop someone up in their like compulsive behavior and not realize you're doing it. In fact, there's 3 examples which me and my friends are aware of. And one of my friends talks openly about this, where I was propping him up.
Yeah.
I was letting him stay at my house. I was providing for him while he was in his struggles. The minute I had a difficult conversation with him when he was, I think I was 25 years old and he was 30. And I said, you got to go. You got to go. You got to get out of my house.
Out of here.
He went back, moved in with his parents in his childhood room. He built up his whole life again. Amazing. He's out of the compulsive behaviors. He's very successful, very rich, living abroad now. And I was like, God, if I hadn't have pushed him out my basement, he probably would still be there. Yes. I thought I was doing him a favor.
Yes.
And there's another really pertinent example to me quite recently where someone who I've known for many, many, many years, minute I said to them, listen, and this sounds really harsh, right? Because I tried paying for their therapy, tried paying for everything for this person. And eventually I got to the point where I said, honestly, I've tried, don't talk to me about this anymore.
Yeah.
Stop talking to me about it.
Done.
Just don't message me about it. Yeah. Don't talk to me about it anymore. They got better.
Yep. Yeah. It's really fast. So there, Kai Erikson wrote this book on deviance where he studied Puritan societies and found that no matter what group of humans you looked at, there were always going to be people who were on the margins of the society. He used the word deviance. His point being that groups of humans, we just have these roles and we have these hierarchies, and there's always somebody on top and always somebody below. And when we're occupying a certain niche or when we stop occupying it, we make room for somebody else. So when you stop being the hero and the savior, that person had room to stop being the sick victim.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And my last question on this then is, how do you approach that conversation with that person? Because so often it's approached through frustration or shame or blame. What's the best way to approach someone who's struggling with a behavior, to express that you're concerned and to, I don't know, offer your help if that's a good thing?
I think we can always try to find our empathy for them without necessarily doing things that would perpetuate or enable that behavior. And we need to recognize that for many people with severe addiction, the only thing that will get them into recovery is real life consequences, real life negative consequences, and that our trying to protect them from that is not protecting them at all.
We've got to let them hit the rock bottom.
I mean, this is a hard one because you have a lot of families now dealing with children who are severely addicted to opioids, for whom, being out on the streets might really result in their death. So this is not for every situation, but I can tell you in my clinical experience after 25 plus years, the majority of people with severe addiction who get into recovery as the result of a real life negative consequences. Lost their job, lost their partner, ended up in jail, whatever it was. Until there are those significant consequences, for some people, they just won't be able to have the motivation to make a change.
Goes back to a quote I heard a long time ago, some 10 years ago, that said, change happens when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of making a change.
There you go. That's a good one.
In an attempt to offer people out there now that are struggling with some kind of form of compulsive behavior or addiction a pathway to turn this around, what is step one? In your book, I read all these incredible ideas around the wisdom we can learn from addicts. I learned about dopamine fasting, and I also learned about radical honesty and the role that plays. What is the process? So someone listening to this right now, they're struggling with one of these addictions. They've got a pornography addiction. They're addicted to gaming. Maybe it's food. Maybe it's erotic novels. Maybe they're on the Twilight. They're reading Twilight at the moment. What do you say to that person at the step one is?
Step one is really just acknowledging the behavior, that it's problematic and that it might require some changing in our lives. The next step is being honest with ourselves and maybe another person about why we do the behavior, what we get out of it, what's positive. Step three would be honestly making a list of all of the problems with the behavior. How is it interfering with my goals? And as we talked about, my values. What do other people say to me about how it's problematic? Is one of the problems potentially that it's just not working anymore the way that it used to, right? I'm developing tolerance. I need more to get the same effect. It's doing the opposite of what I want it to do. And after we've done all that, really done a really honest self-assessment about the behavior, I recommend a 30-day dopamine fast. Now, we're not really fasting from dopamine, right? Because we're not really ingesting dopamine. What we're doing a fast from is whatever that substance or behavior is that is causing these kinds of problems, potentially. Maybe we aren't even really sure, but we think it might be. Give it up for 30 days. Why 30 days? Well, we know that 2 weeks is not enough, right? We know that from this imaging study, right? That people are still in that dopamine deficit state 2 weeks after stopping. But 30 days based on clinical experience, not just mine, but that of many other people who do this work, that for most people, no matter the drug and no matter sort of the severity and chronicity, once they get to about 30 days, they begin to feel better. They begin to come out of that tunnel of constant craving. They begin to be able to imagine a life in which they would not necessarily have to rely on this substance or on this behavior. What I always tell folks when they're preparing for the dopamine fast is just remember, you will feel worse before you feel better. But that is withdrawal-mediated suffering. Once you get through those first 14 days, you'll begin to feel better. And potentially by 30 days, you'll feel much better than you have in a really long time. Now, this is not to say that 30 days of fasting is going to cure your addiction, not at all. But it's the beginning. It's the beginning of being able to see causality, getting some insight. It's an experiment, right? Our lives are one big experiment. What better way to understand the variables in our lives than to change one thing, one variable, and see what happens?
Do we then need to, you talk about this concept of self-binding?
Yes.
Self-binding.
Right.
What role does that play in all of this?
Self-binding is a way of acknowledging that if we rely on willpower alone, we will not be successful, especially living in this drugified world. And what we need to do is anticipate desire before we're in the throes of desire by creating both literal and metacognitive or thought, Gedunken experiment, like barriers between ourselves and our drug of choice. So these barriers can be actual physical barriers, like putting our device into a kitchen safe and locking it up over the night, or leaving it outside of our bedroom, or getting the potato chips, the alcohol, the cannabis out of the house, deleting our contact drug dealer's information and telling our drug dealer, don't call me and I won't call you.
Because these are all cues.
These are all cues, that's right.
And the cues can be physical things. So someone I see, cues can also be basically an emotion. You talked about halt, hungry, angry,
right.
lonely,
yes.
tired. I eat well during the day. Like now, as I leave here, there'll be a salad, I reckon, in the green room over there for me. And the only time where I'm susceptible to not eating well is if it's late. And so when you said the hungry, angry, lonely, tired thing, that is probably the state that I'm in sometimes when I get home. Certainly hungry, certainly tired, probably a little bit lonely as well, but certainly those two things. And that seems to be when I'm most susceptible to making a regrettable decision as it relates to my dopamine. I've also wondered if dopamine is responsible for what people almost call like the sugar cravings that we have. So what I've observed is in previous years of my life, when I was eating lots of sugar, I would then go into about like a 2-week cycle of like binging the sugar. Yeah. And right now I'm in like a really great cycle with my food where I have no cravings for the sugar. I'm staying in a hotel here in LA. There's a mini bar in the room with Oreos and gummy, all these chocolates and all these things. And I haven't touched them because for some reason in this like couple of weeks of my life or whatever, I just don't have the cravings anymore. But I kind of suspect that if I start eating them, then the next 4 weeks will be a car crash.
Yes.
Why does this happen?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And I think this is sort of a universal experience. So first of all, sugar is addictive. It lights up the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. Clear dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, part of the reward pathway in response to sugar. And when we quit sugar, we have a come down, right? We go into withdrawal, and it's manifested in all the different ways that we've talked about. And it lasts for about 2 weeks. And one of the most salient symptoms is intense craving for sugar. And it's so amazing how intense it is. But if we can get through that period and get out of that vortex of addictive craving, the craving gradually gets better and then eventually goes away, which is, by the way, very paradoxical because whatever our drug is, when we first stop it, we have intense cravings and we have the feeling that the cravings will only get worse with time. Even though we logically may have experienced otherwise by giving it up before, we have the feeling this is going to last forever. It never does, right? With time, the craving goes away. And once we are in that arena where we're not constantly craving, we might have something that triggers the craving, right? But like stress, but generally we're not dealing with a craving. If we were then to re-expose our brains to a little bit of sugar, immediately back in the vortex of craving. And there's an experiment I love that illustrates this. It's an experiment in rats where rats were injected with cocaine, the same amount of cocaine every day for 7 days. And over the course of those 7 days, the rats went from kind of hiding in the shadows of the cage to progressively running a little bit more and a little bit more. And by day 7, they were in a running frenzy, right? As measured by these beams of light that they were crossing. Then there was no more cocaine injected after 7 days, and no cocaine or any addictive substance administered to the rats for a year, which is a rat lifetime, a really long time. That would make you think, that there's no more cocaine in the system, no, none of that. And then the rats were injected with a single dose of cocaine, and immediately they were plunged back into that running frenzy that you saw on day 7. Really important information because it tells us that there's some kind of permanent latent echo in our brains once we've been exposed to, and especially if we become addicted to, a particular substance, such that even with sustained abstinence on the order of years and decades, if we are re-exposed to that drug, we can immediately be plunged into the depths of our addiction. There's no ramp-up period that happens. And of course, we see this all the time. People with alcohol addiction who are then exposed to alcohol and right back to their max use, or even exposed to something like opioids. And alcohol also works on our endogenous opioid system, so there's some homology or similarity between alcohol and opioids. And then immediately being plunged into opioid addiction, which then leads them back to their alcohol addiction.
It made me think about children.
Mm-hmm.
It made me think about children because if I'm a 5-year-old and I'm binging on sugar, this sets me up for a life where I'm going to be, based on the analogy the experiment I just had there, it sets me up for a life where I'm going to so easily slip right back into that addiction for sugar. And also I know that the brain isn't fully developed when we're children, so maybe the effect is even more lasting and significant. Is any of that true?
Yeah, it's all true, which is why a big focus of the addiction medicine field is prevention and trying to make sure that we protect kids' brains from the harms of these addictive substances and behaviors.
Like what?
From sugar to digital media, video games, pornography, social media, or any other drug, nicotine. So many kids are vaping now, taking 50 plus puffs a day on their nicotine vape, cannabis, alcohol.